What changes at 45 that no one prepares you for? Carl Jung Psychology. Carl Jung observed that the psyche does not simply continue in a straight line from youth to old age, but turns, somewhere near its middle, the way a river turns when it meets a ridge of rock it did not know was there. Here is the premise, stated plainly, and then argued. Jung wrote in an essay on the stages of life, CW8, paragraph 784, that we cannot live the afternoon of life according to the program of life's morning, for what was great in the morning will be little at evening, and what in the morning was true will at evening have become a lie. And Jung would stop you right there and ask you to notice something. He is not saying the morning program was wrong. He is saying it expires. The ambitions that got you through your 20s and 30s, the proving, the striving, the building of a name and a household and a bank account, none of that was a mistake. It was simply built for a season that has an ending. And at 45, many people feel the ground shift and conclude that something has gone wrong with them, when in fact something has gone right. The old program has finished running, and a new one is waiting to be written. But almost no one told you this was coming, so it lands like a fall rather than like a threshold. So let me say the resolution with you, in the first person, the way Jung himself circled back again and again to his own inner material. I am not falling apart at midlife. I am outgrowing a program that already did its work. I stop mistaking the end of a season for the end of myself, and I make the unconscious conscious. Say it with me. I am not falling apart at midlife. I am outgrowing a program that already did its work. I stop mistaking the end of a season for the end of myself, and I make the unconscious conscious. Again, I am not falling apart at midlife. I am outgrowing a program that already did its work. I stop mistaking the end of a season for the end of myself, and I make the unconscious conscious. If this is the first time you have sat with me by this fire, consider staying, so that tomorrow's teaching finds you too, before the keys. Do this one small thing for yourself. If something in what I have said just made you go quiet inside, type the 2 words "face it" in the comments. Not as a performance for anyone else, just as a seal on the moment, a way of marking that you heard it. The first key is that what changes at 45 is not your character, it is your fuel. For most of the first half of life, you run on what Jung called the morning program, the drive to separate from your parents, to establish yourself in a career, to find a partner, to build a household, to prove to the world and to yourself that you exist and matter. This program is not shallow, it is necessary. A young person without ambition and without the will to build a life is a young person in trouble. But the program has a design flaw built into its very success. It was never meant to run forever. Think of it like a rocket booster. It exists to get you off the ground and into orbit, and then its job is finished. And if you keep firing it after the fuel is spent, you do not go higher, you simply burn out the engine. This is what so many people at 45 mistake for personal failure. They keep trying to want the promotion the way they wanted it at 28. They keep trying to feel proud of the house the way they felt proud the day they bought it. And it does not come. And they think, something is wrong with me. I should still care about this. But Jung would say, nothing is wrong with you. The fuel that ran the first half is simply gone. Spent honestly, spent well, and you are standing on the empty tank wondering why the engine will not fire. Consider a man who spends 15 years chasing a title at work, arrives early, stays late, and finally at 46 sits in the corner office he once dreamed about. And one ordinary Tuesday afternoon, he looks up from his desk and feels absolutely nothing. No pride, no relief, only a flat grey quiet. He assumes he has become ungrateful, or lazy, or broken somehow. But he is not broken. The booster has simply finished its burn. The orbit it was built for has already been reached, and no rocket in history has ever been asked to keep firing once it arrives. This is not decline. This is completion. And completion, before it is recognized, almost always feels like loss. Think too of a garden at the end of its season. The tomatoes have given everything they had, The vine is spent, and a gardener who does not understand seasons might stand there in autumn, mourning the empty stakes, when the truth is simply that this particular planting finished its work. The ground is not dead. It is only waiting to be turned for what comes next. Your ambitions were a planting too, not a permanent structure, and a season that ends is not a season that failed. So if you are 45, and the things that used to move you now feel flat, hear this clearly. That flatness is not a verdict on your life. It is a signal that a chapter has closed its final page. And no signal of that kind has ever meant the book is finished. I do not mourn an empty tank. I ask what the next fuel is. The second key is that the parts of yourself you set aside to build the first half of life do not vanish. They wait. Jung taught that individuation, the process of becoming who you actually are, rather than who circumstance required you to be, is not a straight climb, it is a return. Somewhere around 25, you made a series of quiet decisions. Maybe you loved painting, but you needed a steady income, so you took the job in accounting. Maybe you loved solitude, but you needed a family, so you learned to perform sociability at every gathering. Maybe you had a temper you were ashamed of, so you built a personality of relentless agreeableness. These were not betrayals. They were the practical compromises anyone makes to get a life off the ground. But every part of you that you set into a drawer and closed does not decompose in there. It waits, patient, in a way nothing else in your life is patient, and somewhere near midlife the drawer begins to rattle. Consider a man who once played guitar every evening in his 20s, badly, happily, for no reason but the sound of it, and who packed the guitar away when the first child arrived because evenings became feeding schedules and diaper changes, and there was simply no room left. This was not a tragedy. It was a father doing what fathers do. But 20 years later, at a wedding, a stranger picks up a guitar in the corner of the room and plays 3 simple chords. And this man feels his throat tighten for no reason he can name. He tells his wife in the car that he is just tired. But it is not tiredness, it is the drawer, rattling. Because the part of him that loved sound for its own sake, with no purpose and no paycheck attached, has been waiting quietly for 20 years to be let out again. And it chose a stranger's 3 chords at a wedding to knock. Because that is when his guard happened to be down. This is why so many people at 45 find themselves suddenly furious at a spouse for no clear reason, or weeping at a piece of music they used to ignore, or lying awake wanting to quit a stable career for something that makes no financial sense. The ego calls this a crisis, but Jung would call it a return address, the unlived life sending mail. And it does not only send grand letters, sometimes it sends small ones. You scroll past an old photograph on a Tuesday afternoon, yourself at 22, paint on your hands, and something in your chest drops for exactly 4 seconds before you close the app and answer an email. That 4 seconds was the drawer, cracking open, and you closed it again, without even deciding to, because closing it has become so practiced, it no longer feels like a choice at all. Here is the part almost no one prepares you for. The drawer does not ask politely. It does not wait for a convenient month. It rattles precisely when your defenses are lowest, which is usually exactly at midlife, when the morning program has run dry and there is less noise left to drown it out. Imagine a woman who spent 20 years being the reliable one at work and at home, praised for it, built her whole identity on it, and then at 46, she finds herself weeping in the car after ordinary meetings for reasons she cannot name. She is not falling apart, she is hearing. For the first time in decades, the knock of everything she set aside in order to be reliable, the softness she trained out of herself, the need to be cared for rather than always caring. The question is never whether the drawer will open, only whether you will open it on your own terms, deliberately, with your own hand on the handle, or whether it will force itself open through your body, your marriage, your health, because a drawer denied long enough stops knocking politely and starts breaking the desk. I open the drawer myself before it opens itself through me. The third key is that even Jung himself was not exempt from this. And his own collapse is one of the most instructive things he left us, Jung recalled in Memories Dreams. Reflections that in 1913, at the age of 38, right at the threshold of midlife, he entered what he called a period of inner uncertainty. One could also call it a state of disorientation. He had already broken from Freud. He had already achieved standing as a psychiatrist. By every outward measure, he had succeeded at the morning program. And yet inwardly he felt, in his own words, as though suspended in mid-air with nothing to stand on. He began having visions of Europe drowning in blood. He did not know at the time these were prophetic of a war about to break. He only knew that his own inner ground had given way beneath him. And this is worth sitting with for a moment. A man with a thriving practice, a wife, young children, a respected name in Zurich. A man who by any outward measure had nothing left to prove, and still the floor opened beneath him, exactly when the striving finally slowed enough to let him feel it. Notice that the collapse did not arrive during his hardest working years. It arrived once the morning program had done its work and grown quiet. That timing is not a coincidence. It is the pattern itself. And here is what he did. And this is the part worth sitting with slowly. He did not distract himself. He did not simply push through with more work. He sat down on the floor of his study and let himself, in his own phrase, drop. He let the fantasies and images that were pressing up from below actually come. He wrote them down. He painted them. He built small stone villages by a lake near his house. He took the whole strange activity as seriously as he took his patients, for years, and what emerged from that descent became the foundation of everything he later taught the world, the concept of archetypes, of the collective unconscious, of individuation itself. All of it was quarried out of that period when a successful 38-year-old man felt the floor of his life disappear. And it is worth saying plainly, this was not comfortable for him. He doubted his own sanity more than once during those years. He kept careful notes, precisely because he was frightened of losing his footing entirely, and he later cautioned that this kind of descent should only be attempted by someone with a stable footing in ordinary life, a steady work, a steady home, something solid to return to each evening. The descent is not a technique to be performed lightly, or alone without such ground beneath you. Now consider what this means for you, at 45. Jung was not a special case exempt from this law. He was the first careful witness of it, applied to himself before he ever applied it to a patient. If the man who mapped this territory had to walk through his own disorientation without a map, then your disorientation now is not proof that something has gone wrong with your particular life. It is proof that you are walking a road every serious person eventually walks. The difference is only whether you walk it consciously, the way Jung eventually did, sitting with the descent and writing down what it gave him, or whether you spend the same years trying to sprint back uphill toward the morning program that has already closed its account. Imagine a man of 45, successful by every visible measure, who feels this same floor tremble and responds by working 80-hour weeks to outrun the feeling. He takes on a new project he does not need. He fills his calendar so completely that no evening has room for a single quiet thought. And for a while it works. The noise drowns the knocking, but the feeling does not leave. It only waits for a quieter hour, usually at 3 in the morning, staring at a ceiling, wondering why none of it feels like enough anymore. Compare that man to a neighbor of similar age who, feeling the same tremor, simply sits with it some evenings, instead of reaching for the phone or the next task, who lets an old memory or a strange image surface without immediately explaining it away. The second man is not doing anything mystical. He is only doing what Jung did on the floor of his study, giving the descent room instead of a deadline, and slowly, unglamorously, something in him begins to settle that all the busyness of the first man never touched. That is not a character flaw in either of them. That is the unlived life, still sending its mail, now with more urgency, and the only real question left is whether you open it at your own table or let it find you at 3 in the morning. Instead, I do not sprint from the descent. I sit down and let it speak. The fourth key is that achievement was never designed to hold the weight you are now asking it to carry, Jung wrote of patience. And you can find the pattern all through CW7, men and women who had climbed every visible rung, who had done precisely what the culture told them to do, and who arrived at the top of the ladder only to discover the ladder was leaning against the wrong wall. And here is the trouble: achievement is measured in the currency of the world, a title, a salary, a corner office, a name on a door, and the world's currency can buy you many things, but it was never minted to purchase an inner sense of who you are, so people at 45 keep spending it anyway. More hours, more targets, another promotion chased with the same hunger that used to feel like ambition and now feels closer to panic. And the strange discovery waiting at the end of that chase is that the currency simply does not convert. Imagine a businessman, and this is a composite, drawn from the pattern Jung described, rather than a single named case. A man who built a company from nothing, who worked every holiday for 25 years to make sure his family never wanted for anything, who finally sold the business at 50 and retired exactly as planned, and who found himself, 3 months later, sitting in a quiet house with nothing to conquer, the calendar empty for the first time since he was 22. And the quiet did not feel like peace, it felt like a verdict. He had spent so completely on building that he had built nothing of an inner life to retire into. No room furnished, no relationship with himself that did not run through a title. Picture him now on an ordinary Tuesday morning, no meeting to attend, sitting in the chair by the window where he used to plan expansion, the framed award from a trade association still hanging slightly tilted on the wall where an assistant hung it years ago, and he realizes he cannot remember the last time anyone asked him a question that was not about the business. This is the trap of identifying entirely with the persona, the professional mask. When the mask was the whole self, and the mask is finally set down, there is a real question of who exactly is left standing there. And it is not a comfortable question, and it does not resolve itself simply because the man is intelligent or disciplined or has read every book on retirement planning, because retirement planning was written for money, not for selfhood. This is not an argument against achievement. Jung never condemned ambition. He simply insisted it could not be the entire architecture of a life meant to last 80 or 90 years. The morning program builds the house, but if you never furnish a room inside it for the parts of you that are not about winning, the house stands there magnificent and empty, walls perfectly plastered, trophies dusted weekly, and nobody actually living inside. And at 45 or 50, or whenever the applause quiets down even slightly, that emptiness becomes impossible to outrun any longer. You can hear it in the particular silence of a house after a celebration ends. The caterer's gone, the guests gone, the achievement itself still sitting there on the mantel, and you standing in the doorway of your own kitchen, wondering why the thing you worked 30 years for feels, at 10 at night, like furniture belonging to somebody else. I build more than a house of achievement. I furnish a room to actually live in. If any of this is landing for you, and you would like the next teaching to find you without having to go looking for it, consider staying with me here. I will keep bringing these fireside conversations, one at a time. As long as you keep showing up to listen. The fifth key is the one that actually holds the others together, and it takes some unfolding, so let us take it slowly, in pieces, because this is the deep water of the whole teaching. First, consider what Jung meant by individuation itself. He called it, in CW7, paragraph 266, a coming to selfhood, and he chose his words with real precision here. He did not say a coming to happiness, and he did not say a coming to comfort. He said a coming to selfhood, which means the goal of the second half of life is not to feel good, it is to become whole. And those two things are not the same thing at all. Wholeness includes the grief for the years spent proving yourself. Wholeness includes the anger you never let yourself feel at work, because it would have cost you the promotion. Wholeness includes the tenderness you buried, because it did not fit the persona you built. Individuation is not a reward you receive for good behavior. It is a demand that the psyche makes on you, whether or not you consent. And here is the part that catches most people off guard. You can have every outward sign of a well-lived life, a marriage, a title, a paid-off house, and still feel, quietly, at 3 in the afternoon on an ordinary Tuesday, that none of it has actually reached you. That is not ingratitude, and it is not depression in the clinical sense. It is the psyche telling you that happiness and wholeness were never the same current. One can rise while the other stays exactly where it was. This is what Jung meant when he wrote in Ion, that when an inner situation is not made conscious, it happens outside, as fate. The parts of you that go unlived do not simply disappear politely. They show up as the affair you cannot explain, the health scare that arrives out of nowhere, the sudden rage at a child for a small mistake, the restlessness that no amount of vacation seems to touch. At 45, fate starts knocking louder, specifically because the morning program, which used to keep you too busy to hear the knocking, has finally quieted down enough for you to notice. Second, consider the actual word Jung used, individual. He liked to point out that the word individual comes from a root meaning undivided. So to individuate is not to become more separate from others, as the word sounds to modern ears. It is to become undivided within yourself, to stop being at war between the ambitious achiever and the tired soul underneath it, between the reliable performer and the person who sometimes just wants to sit by a window and do nothing. Most people at 45 are living exactly this kind of divided life. One hand building the resume, the other hand quietly starving, and the discomfort of midlife is not a malfunction, it is the discomfort of a house with 2 tenants who have never once spoken to each other, finally being forced, by circumstance, to share a table. Picture that table for a moment. On one side sits the version of you that shows up early, answers every email, remembers every birthday, never complains. On the other side sits the version of you that has been sitting quietly in the corner for 20 years, wanting only to be asked a single honest question. And for most of your life you have let the first one speak for both, ordering the meal, making the plans, deciding what counts as a good life, and the second one has simply gone along with it. Until now. Until 45. When the second one finally reaches across the table and taps your hand, this is not a breakdown of the self, it is the self, for the first time, insisting on being one thing instead of 2/3. And this is the part that turns the lens back onto you specifically. So let me ask you directly, rather than in the abstract. Pause for a moment and pick one real thing. One specific thing you set aside in your 20s or 30s because it was impractical, because it did not pay, because it embarrassed you, because someone told you to be serious. It might be a creative pursuit. It might be a friendship you let lapse for the sake of career. It might simply be the capacity to rest without guilt. Hold that one thing in your mind now and ask yourself honestly, has it been quiet lately? Or has it been knocking? Because if you are 45 and something in you has been restless in a way you cannot name, there is a real chance that restlessness has an address, and the address is the thing you just named. Fourth, understand that this is not a single dramatic event. It is not a thunderclap after which you wake up whole. Individuation happens the way a shoreline is shaped, by the same tide arriving again and again, in small, honest turns, a conversation you finally have instead of avoiding, an hour you finally spend on the thing, rather than justifying why you cannot, a feeling you finally let yourself name instead of calling it tiredness. No single one of these turns feels like much on the day it happens. But Jung watched this process in his patients for decades, and what he saw was cumulative, not sudden. So do not wait for the lightning bolt that tells you the work is done. The work does not finish, it simply becomes more honest. Now, walk with me through an ordinary day the way this actually plays out for someone in exactly your position. Imagine waking at 6, already running through the list, the meeting at 9, the child needing a form signed, the aging parent who called twice yesterday. By 8 you are at your desk, and the morning program is fully in charge, competent, efficient, exactly as trained. By noon there is a small gap, 5 minutes between calls, and in that gap, a feeling arrives from nowhere, a kind of low grey weight. You call it tiredness, and you move on. By 3 in the afternoon, a colleague mentions offhand that they are learning to paint on weekends, and something in your chest tightens for half a second. You do not know why. You call it envy. And Jung would call it the map. Remember, gold hides exactly where envy points. By 5, you are driving home, and a song from 20 years ago comes on the radio. And for no reason you can explain, your eyes sting. You turn it off before the second verse. By 6, you are home, going through the motions of dinner, asking about homework, nodding along. And by 10, lying in bed, the day's business finally quiet, that low grey weight returns, larger now, unhurried, patient in the way only something true can be patient. And you lie there wondering why a life that looks, on paper, entirely successful, feels like it is being lived by someone else, that is not a single bad day, that is the unlived life running its quiet campaign underneath a fully functioning morning program, all day, every day, waiting for the noise to drop low enough to be heard. And notice, it never once shouted, it only ever tapped. The tightness in the chest, the sting behind the eyes, the grey weight at midnight, these are not crises, they are messages, and they have likely been arriving for years, addressed to you, and quietly returned unopened. Here, then, is the exercise. Plainly, take one evening this week, sit with paper, and write down what Jung would call your morning program. The goals, roles, and rules you built your first half of life around. Be honest and specific, then beside each one write whether it still holds true at your current age or whether you have simply kept obeying it out of habit. Then, underneath that list, write the one thing you named a moment ago, the thing that has been quiet or knocking, and write beside it, honestly, when did you last give it even 10 unguarded minutes? This is not a test to pass or fail, it is only an honest audit, the kind Jung himself performed on his own life at 38, sitting on the floor of his study, letting the images come. You do not need visions, you only need honesty, and paper, and 20 quiet minutes, and the willingness to let the second tenant, finally, say something at the table. I stop obeying a program that has already finished its work. The 6th key is a small correction, and a closing gift. You will sometimes hear it said that life begins at 40, as though there were a switch that flips, and everything after is simply bonus round. That phrase belongs to a writer named Walter Pitkin, from 1932. It is not Jung, and it flattens something Jung actually thought was far more serious and far more interesting than a slogan. You will also hear the term midlife crisis thrown around, as though Jung invented it. He did not. That phrase comes from a psychoanalyst named Elliot Jacques in 1965, borrowing the shape of Jung's observations, but sharpening them into something closer to a diagnosis. A thing gone wrong to be managed, and once a thing is named a crisis, people start treating it the way they treat a leak in the roof, something to patch quickly and never think about again. A new hobby, a new car, a new distraction. Anything to make the feeling stop, rather than to ask what the feeling is for. Imagine a man at 46 who reads about a midlife crisis online, decides that is what he has, buys a motorcycle he does not really want, and feels the same low-weight return within a month because he treated the door as a malfunction instead of an invitation and patched the wrong wall entirely. Jung's own view was gentler and, I think, truer. He did not see 45 as a crisis to survive. He saw it as a doorway. The German word he sometimes used carried the sense of a genuine turning point. A Wendepunkt, not a collapse but a hinge. On one side of the hinge stands the life you built to prove yourself to the world. On the other side stands the life you are invited to build simply because it is true. And a hinge, unlike a crisis, is not something you rush past or medicate away. It is something you stand in for a while, feeling the draft from both rooms at once. And here is the mercy in this teaching. You are not late. You are not behind. You have not wasted the first half. The first half built the house. You now get to actually live inside. The striving was not wasted. It was preparation. The meetings, the mortgage, The years of proving yourself, none of it was a detour from your real life. It was the scaffolding your real life needed in order to stand at all. And the fact that it stopped feeling like enough is not evidence that you failed at it. It is evidence that it finished doing its job. A scaffold that stays bolted to a finished house is not a sign of care. It is only clutter. So if you are standing at 45, or anywhere close to it, feeling the floor shift beneath the life you worked so hard to build, take this as your closing thought. That is not the ground falling away. That is a door opening, quietly, the way doors in old houses do, without announcement, and no one ever prepared you for it, because so few people, including Jung himself at 38, sitting alone on the floor of his study, are ever prepared for a door they did not know was there. The invitation was never to hurry through it, only to notice that it has. At last, come open and on. I walk through the door, rather than mourn the hallway behind me. Here is the whole picture. The fuel of the morning program runs out. And that is not failure. The unlived life waits in a drawer and eventually knocks. Jung himself fell through this exact floor at 38 and turned the fall into everything he later taught. Achievement was never built to hold the whole weight of a life. Individuation asks for wholeness rather than comfort, and undivided simply means the two halves of you finally sitting at the same table. And 45 is not a crisis borrowed from a slogan or a diagnosis. It is a door, one key, turned 6 different ways, all of it saying the same quiet thing, that what is changing in you now is not decline, it is invitation. I am not falling apart at midlife. I am outgrowing a program that already did its work. I stop mistaking the end of a season for the end of myself, and I make the unconscious conscious. So tell me, gently, as you sit with whatever this evening has stirred in you, what has been knocking in your own drawer, and are you finally ready to let it in?